If you are in a executive meeting or a board meeting and you're navigating a tough scenario, should we do this? Should we do that? Eventually your CFO or whoever is going to say, well, here's what the numbers say. This way we make this much money. This way we make that much money. The conversation is generally over at that point. We would often try to bring in other values in that, like, well, the creative community needs this, or we think it's better for our reputation if we do that. You end up in this unfair fight where you have a hard value and you have a soft value. So how could that be different? What would a world look like where some of those more soft values had equal footing? And like the financial argument actually had to compete on a level playing field of here's what we agree is important, here's how we measure those things, or here's how we track those things. What would that practically look like?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. In a world where companies are often judged entirely by their profits, Yancey Strickler aimed to build something different. A company where values mattered more than money. As the co-founder and former CEO of Kickstarter, he witnessed firsthand how many businesses were solely focused on maximizing their financial gains. Realizing that wealth didn't always equate to success, Yancey started shaping a workplace culture and philosophy that valued impact beyond the balance sheet. Informed by his experiences at Kickstarter, Yancey realized that the ethos of financial maximization is the driving force behind many social ills. It is both recent and a choice. He wrote, "This Could Be Our Future," about how to apply a philosophy he developed called Bentoism that shows how to look beyond short-term returns to see longer-term benefits for ourselves and others. Yancey is now the co-founder of Metalabel, which is a very exciting new space for releasing, selling, and exhibiting creative work. In this episode, Yancey and I talk about the overpowering culture of financial maximization, defining a company's value beyond profits, and how these ideas influenced Kickstarter's bylaws. We also discuss the origin and principles of Bentoism, the equity rules of his recent startup, Metalabel, the value of hierarchy in organizations, Yancey's most significant career lessons, and other topics. All right, to support Work for Humans, consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, my conversation with Yancey Strickler. Yancey Strickler, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks for having me on.
As you might imagine, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of business books. So many of them, they're basically how-tos. They're how to do something. And I've been reading your book, which I know was written 5 years ago now. This Could Be Our Future is the name of your book, and it's a manifesto for a more generous world. It has some how-tos to it, but more than anything, it's a why-to. And I feel like you've dug deeper into the psyche of our society than many of the people that I read. And in particular, I think we're doing something fairly deep with this show, which is that we're exploring the idea that our business models are wrong and that we should look at employees as customers and that we should look at work as a product that's being designed and sold to customers. You've gone deeper, all the way to question the roots of financial maximization, which most of us grew up inside, so we can hardly even see it. And so I want to start there, and I want to talk about what is the culture of financial maximization? Where did it start? What harm is it doing?
Thank you for having me on. Thank you for opening up the space to have these sorts of conversations. I didn't think about how that book is not a how-to, but as you started saying that, I immediately thought, oh yeah, it's a why. And so I like that you finished that sentence. And I previously was the co-founder and the CEO of Kickstarter. And a lot of that book is about trying to understand the context that project lived within. We started from the beginning, the three of us who started it, we were all music people. We were not business people and not that interested or excited about that part of things. Just here's a fun creative project to do together. And we didn't want the project to end up in certain ways. From the very beginning, we said we don't want to sell, we don't want to go public, we want to make a public trust almost, something that's just there and so dependable. Craigslist, always the model. Craigslist, how can you beat Craigslist? What's better than Craigslist? I still stand by that. And especially as you're getting into fundraising, as you're running an organization that grows to have more than 100 people, that has a CFO that's taking you through the budget every month, these larger concerns of, well, where is this ultimately going? And how big can this get? And who can we sell this to? What's the exit? And all those things are these omnipresent questions, whether you want to answer them or not. And we ended up taking steps of becoming a public benefit corporation, one of the first companies to convert to a public benefit corporation, to write into our corporate bylaws that we were not playing that game. We were trying to design our own different game. And that act of creating that charter, making that step, really made clear that we were trying to step out of one context in which we weren't even aware that we were in until we felt it, into a different context in which our sense of value could be defined by what we wanted and not just how much money the company was making or its potential to make more money for other people. And what the book explores is how this same question is endemic across society. And I use a phrase all the time. You would think I got paid by the syllable for how long the phrase is, but financial maximization. And I just said that is this default assumption that in any decision, the right outcome is the one that makes the most money. And that is not always the wrong decision. In many cases, that is the right way of thinking about it. But it is definitely not the right one all the time. And what I reflected on in my experience was that if you are in a executive meeting or a board meeting and you're navigating a tough scenario, should we do this? Should we do that? Eventually your CFO or whoever is going to say, well, here's what the numbers say. This way we make this much money. This way we make that much money. The conversation is generally over at that point. There might still be some debating, but that's just, well, there you have it. And we would often try to bring in other values in that, like, well, the creative community needs this, or we think it's better for our reputation if we do that. Well, how much better for our reputation? How do you quantify that? And what is the value of our creative community? Or, all these things that you end up in this unfair fight where you have a hard value and you have a soft value. And in those rooms, even if everyone's heart is in the right place, it is hard, except in a crisis. Only in a crisis are you given the freedom to make a soft value choice and not a hard value choice. But any other situation, the hard value choice is going to win. So how could that be different? How could that be different? What would a world look like where some of those more soft values had equal footing? And like the financial argument actually had to compete on a level playing field of here's what we agree is important, here's how we measure those things, or here's how we track those things. But what would that practically look like? And so, I was just trying to imagine that. And I didn't have that while I was CEO of Kickstarter. And we did okay managing that because we were constantly conflicted. But there were numerous moments where I was like, I won't say numerous, but there were moments where I don't know if we got to the right place in this because it was just hard. It was so unclear. It was hard to justify, but my gut says maybe there's a different path. And so it's just trying to explore that feeling in those questions.
When you say hard and soft, does hard mean, oh, we can put a number to it? And soft means we probably can't?
The way I define in the book is to say there's a difference between value singular, which is a economics quantification term, and values plural, which is more of a qualitative adjective kind of term. I mean, all of us operate through both of these. Most of our decisions are made through values plural, how we treat our partner or what we do any given day. 90% of our decisions as individuals are made that way. But in businesses, it's like 90% are made by that hard numerical value of just money. So what I imagine and what I think I've seen is that you can move something that exists in that humanities values context. If you think of it as a spectrum, you can slide it across the spectrum to a hard numerical value through measurement, through a lot of things that are pretty fraught and are difficult to get right and have many secondary effects that are hard to predict. But that is something that happens. And in a digital age and an age of the computer, that is actually something that is quite simple in a way. Defining the parameters is hard, but making systems run off of metrics is something that we have ample infrastructure to let us do. But yeah, I think the number, which is dangerous, we know all the laws about how numbers can be dangerous. Operating towards the goal, all these things are fraught. But I think the number is the unlock for a organization because it just provides a clear, undisputable language that everyone assumes, seems clear that you have to align with. Seems the most obvious thing in the world. And in many cases, it is.
It's weird to me, though. I do realize that we consider numbers more real than sometimes what we can see with our eyes, or feel.
What do I think is most important? Things I feel but don't know. Things you feel but don't know, that's new information. That's truth. Those are the things to listen to. But yes, it is hard in a coordinated system to operate in that way.
What were some of the bylaws of Kickstarter?
There were, I think, 13, if I remember. They include the company would donate 5% of its after-tax profits to organizations providing arts education and fighting systemic inequality. The company is prohibited from using legal but esoteric tax avoidance strategies. No data will ever be sold. Employees will be given time to work on their own creative projects. There was like what is this thing? Who do we want to be? Who does this need to always be? What does it always need to be? And so those were set and voted on by all of our shareholders. Everyone voted yes. And then there's been an annual report the company's done since. That was in 2015 that happened to show, again, they have to have metrics. Here's our metric.
Mm-hmm.
Even the company does metrics there, but yeah.
Did you find yourself really alone among your peers at the time? Did you sometimes just get people look at you like, what are you talking about? Or did you find
Still
kindred?
do.
Yeah.
Yes and yes. You find your kindred spirits. Sometimes those are seekers who are always seeking. Ideally, it's someone else trying to solve a similar parallel problem, and you're just learning from each other. But Kickstarter began in 2009 in New York. Our peer friend companies coming up were Etsy, Tumblr, Foursquare, great projects, people that we deeply care about or who are still friends. And all of those projects took the raise a lot of money, go big. They took the other path. They were our friends. We talked a lot about that, but we explicitly chose not to do so. And I think within many founders who were friends, there was a sense of little curiosity, maybe a little grass is greener envy of like, oh, what you're doing seems cool. But I mean, it has its own. Every house has its problems. We're the kind of project that we like being the loner. We don't like to belong. That's just kind of in all of our DNA for good and bad. So that definitely showed up.
I want to get to your most recent project. But before we do that, I want to get into Bentoism and how it is a way to help us recover from the default of financial maximization. And then I want to look at your recent project and then reflect back on how it might manifest some of those ideas. How did you arrive at Bentoism, and what is it?
I was writing this book. I knew this book was about expanding the value set beyond financial value and bringing other values and considerations to the table and having them sit equally beside one another. What I didn't know as I was writing the book was my core metaphor for that transition. And so I actually had the whole first half of the book written, kind of the last bit of the book written, and there's this middle couple chapters that's like, the thing. And it's like, what is the thing? And you can imagine the constant self-talk of, you're such a fake. What are you doing? You're going to get caught. You're going to get found out. But I've learned enough about how to manage myself that I ended up inadvertently handling it really well, which is that about halfway into the project, I gave myself a month off where I wasn't going to do any writing and I was only going to read. And part of what I read was the book I had been working on. And during that time, I just kept giving myself different assignments, just like a little assignment each day. And one day, my assignment was, if I had to draw the storyboard of this book like it's an animated movie, how do I do that? So I mapped out the first chapters, which are have a lot of real world examples, quite easy to do. And then I get to this question of the thing. All right, the thing. How do I draw the thing? And in my notebook, I was like, okay, well, there's this financial maximization idea. That's easy to visualize. And I just drew a hockey stick chart of a line going up and to the right, most basic thing in the world. And then as I was looking at it, I just thought, well, it's kind of arbitrary, actually, where I stopped that X and Y axis line. Because if I draw the X out, that's time. Time isn't just this quarter. Time can go forever. It can go backwards too. But if I could stretch that line out, and actually this Y value, I thought of that as self-interest, not money, whatever it is you want. And I thought, well, that also, there's really no ceiling to that. And that actually transitions even as it gets bigger and bigger. So that line can be longer. And suddenly, this hockey stick graph, the little phallus of the hockey stick was suddenly very tiny in this big white space. And I could feel it in my stomach and my chest that was something. And I just thought, what is all this other space? What is all of this? And so I ended up just drawing some lines on it to make it a 2x2. And I labeled each of the boxes. The box where the hockey stick graph lived, I labeled that now me. This is what I individually want and need right now. The box to the right of that one, I labeled future me. So it's not this quarter, it's in the future me. Okay. And I thought, oh, well, how I act now determines who that future me is going to be. That seems relevant. And then when I went up this line of self-interest, okay, what is above this now me? Well, it's us. It's me thinking of the people in my life who I'm accountable to and are accountable to me. So now us. And then the top right was future us. And I instantly saw in that one, just very basic, rudimentary sketch that this was a map to a wider set of dimensions of what self-interest is. And self-interest is not just what I want right now, but it's also what the people around you need. It's who do you want to be? What do you want the world to be? All of those things, they leave footprints in your life. Those are very much a part of your experience. And I wanted to label this graph. And so I wrote next to it, beyond near-term orientation. I thought this is just a way to see beyond near-term orientation. And as I looked at those letters, I saw it was an acronym that said bento. And I looked at the 4 boxes. I said, oh, it's a bento box. Is this too cheesy? Okay, it's a bento box, I guess. And all of that happened in the span of 40 seconds. And it took like a year and a half of a simmer of the crock pot, the one pot, for that moment in my mind being soft enough for a couple weeks of just reading and me not giving myself a hard time of like, you got to have the answer. All of those things together, it just pops out instantly. And I just made a little video at that moment. Here's this thing I made. It's online, but it was like in this moment, it was like, oh, wow, this is all of that intake to this output. And I just have kept playing with it personally. Well, at first I was like, well, what do I think in each of these spaces? So I came to define, well, what are my values? What do I want for now me? What do I want for each of these things? That was an interesting conversation. I started using it to make my weekly to-do list. That was a huge unlock. Okay, what are my now me priorities? Well, I know what those are. It's pay this bill, call this person. What are my future me priorities? Well, exercise, bigger things. Now us, well, I want to call these 3 friends this week. Future us, what am I doing beyond me? And suddenly my weekly to-do list became this interesting mix of work, friends, and personal development, and even like communal development. And so my behavior began to shift. And I was living in LA at the time, and I had this image that this is something people learn about in a living room. And someone tells it to them, and they have like a magazine on their lap and a piece of paper, and they're like drawing it. It's what you tell a friend. And so I started doing these living room workshops in friends' houses in LA and just said, I just want to try something. Can you invite over your friends? And so I started doing these for, first one, I think it was 50 people. I started doing these pretty regularly. And through that, learned how other people interacted with this. And the broad generalization that I still stand by after doing this for many years at this point is that for women who use the bento, instant recognition. Oh yeah, this is what I'm always thinking about. This is helpful to organize this because you know what? This is a lot to carry. Men, almost uniformly, holy shit, there's more than now me? Whoa. Mind blown. Keanu Reeves gif. Women is just like, oh yeah, totally. Nice. Good job, man. Men just lost. But got to see it in the hands of a lot of people. And it really became a community developed off of it. A whole bunch of things happened that were very, very meaningful. But yeah, to me, I think there is a real truth in this notion of dimensions of self-interest. And I think just like with the money values thing, is just put them on the table in a way that they feel as real as the table itself. And when we are able to do that, we are going to make different choices. And it's not easy, but we will. I have faith in people.
It's very interesting because I've done years of research of collecting information about what people want from work, looking at work as a design problem. And it falls very tidily into these boxes. And sometimes I have to make a distinction between, so people, when I ask them what they hire their job to do for them, they will say, I hire it to help others, which is now us. And then others will say, I hire my job to put the world in order. There's something broken in the world. And I used to say, oh, that's help others, but it's actually not. It's future us, which is I'm trying to fix the system in which everybody lives. I can't see myself helping them right this second. And so a lot of the distinctions that I've been and colleagues and I have made would fall into that. And we find ourselves distressed because we are working for a company that's thinking short term and very now me, but our aspiration is much broader.
Yeah. As I have thought more about financial maximization, this is debatable, but I don't think founders are afflicted by financial maximization. Founders are driven by make this thing real. Just make it real. And give me as many hours in the day as I can. I will put every ounce of myself into doing that. Financial maximization happens 1 or 2 generations of owners or leaders later. Once you remove that direct, I was driven to do this because X, and you just get into, well, Jim's a great CEO and he's a great executive from Amex or whatever. That's when you're getting into the private equity, let's just drain this thing. Just today, I was reading about the story of Manchester United, the Premier League club, and how 20 years ago it was bought by these American businessmen who did a PE leverage buyout to buy this thing. And they have just bled that team dry with debt and pulling money out of it. So now the team is like terrible. They're getting a little bit better, but terrible. And it got ruined because these shitheads wanted to drain it of financial value because that's how they see the world. And so this is especially hard because companies, startups, going past that founder moment is really hard because as a founder, I think you got about 12 years in you. And unless you're stronger than most, you're like pretty tapped. It's tough. And so what is supposed to happen? In traditional world, it's the kid takes over the business, the brother, the sister, it stays in the family. But when you go into the open market of we need to hire a search, who has the right ambitious plan for the company, we got to grow, blah, 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 that's when things go off the rails. And so that question of legacy, handover, how do companies survive generations of ownership? That's where this becomes problematic. And I'm not sure how to solve that, but I really think founders don't have this issue. It's the generic executive who really ruins it.
Well, and who's been trained to ruin it.
Right.
In many cases, right? I started using the phrase in my own notes while I was reading this, the banker's gaze. The banker's gaze is you look at everything for its dollar value as opposed to the other aspects of value that it can create. There's just one part about what you wrote in the book that I still want to talk about before we go on to your recent project. And this is the idea that financial maximization has driven a monoculture in so many different domains. It's done it to neighborhoods. It's done it to music. And I don't really understand how it does it, but that it makes the world more uniform by stamping out malls and stamping out chains and stamping out radio stations, which is something you care about a lot, which is what musical content is getting into the world successfully. So I wanted to point that out because it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, capital concentrates and it produces more of itself in its own image. This is where, for the free market to be free, there have to be other constraints that just push it in different directions. I live in New York City, and in the past few years, weed got legalized in New York. And there was a funny process. At first, it got decriminalized. And decriminalized, okay, you don't get arrested. It's cool, we'll look the other way. Decriminalized is pretty chill, pretty chill. And then it goes into like, well, now it's legalized and now it's capitalized. And right now there are like 1,200 weed shops in New York City. And I swear it's easier to buy weed gummies than gummy bears. I really think that might be true. There might be more places to sell weed gummies than gummy bears. And I look at this as, where's that middle point between decriminalization and capital maximization? Because in between there is a healthy society. We're like, oh yeah, some people like that. They can go get that. The rest of us don't have to think about it. That's where we want everything to be. And I think that takes countervailing forces to maintain that are not easy to hold on to. But yeah, we could all be okay if there's just this one line we didn't go too far beyond. But who am I to judge that line, and et cetera, et cetera. I see all the problems with it, but there's a funny space there that I could just see it.
Eventually what's going to happen is that they're all going to be bought by Philip Morris.
100%.
I like what you say, that capital concentrates and capital self-replicates. Those are two things that definitely happen. There was a quote that you had in the book, which I thought was really telling, that too much capitalism does not result in too many capitalists. It results in too few.
Yes.
And that one of the things that happens is that the mom and pop store, for instance, has been stamped over with a chain store. And so, what it reminds me of a little bit is when there was a time, the word commoner meant people who lived on the commons. And so the Lord had all these lands. And then there were commoners who were there who farmed it and gave some of their crop. And then they started enclosing the commons. And they did that because a lord could make more money by enclosing the commons and making that private property. And then what happened was that all the people who had been commoners living on the common became wage laborers working for the enclosed land. And so it's a really classic example, I think, of what the middle ground looks like and what the financial maximization leads to.
I think that's a great observation. And I think two observations I would tap onto that. One is that important to note that financial maximization is a very American identity, not nearly as prevalent really anywhere else in the world. Certainly in Europe, it's there, but not as dominant, certainly not in South America, certainly not in Africa, certainly not maybe some parts of Asia, but like it is a very American thing. Kind of what I was saying about a founder versus later owner, or the example of the commoner. When human beings create things because we need them, want them, whatever, we're just being human, we create things of balance, things that do sit within that space we're talking about. It is over time, as others seek to gain from those or to franchise them or whatever, that you start to get into this secondary level of activity, all of which just leads me to say that I don't think that the conditions we're in are a natural, organic human experience, in the sense that when Adam and Eve first spoke, they're like, what type of business are we making here? What can we sell to that snake? What do they want? Let's triple it. That did not happen. That came much later. This is an artifice of a culture and structure that we're in, of which we benefit and we also suffer. I'm not smarter than it or better than it. I don't have any answers. I'm just observing what I've seen in my own experience. But it is not innately who we are. It is who we have become. And that alone makes it worth asking harder questions about.
So you're launching a new thing, a new startup called Metalabel. And as you look toward founding that, how are you taking the lessons learned from the past? And I think one question I'd have to ask is, why are you founding something? Reading your work, you didn't always love being CEO. CEO is kind of excruciating, but you want to do it again.
You're partially correct. It is excruciating, and I don't really want to do it again, but I believe in service, and I have been called. I have been called, so I don't have a choice, actually. Well, this project starts with the bento, actually. I mentioned leading those workshops, and that became a community called the Bento Society, and then that became a couple thousand people on an email list and who would go to these weekly spaces I held. This was before COVID and then during COVID. And after doing that for about 2.5 years, I just hit a wall. I kept amazing people in the community. I kept inviting people to like step up and co-run with me, and never totally worked. And I found myself trapped, for lack of a better word, as a guru. And based on my amateur experience, being a guru is really boring. You just give a lot, not a lot of take. Well, I think the worst gurus take by exploiting people in all kinds of ways.
That can really be financially maximized. I'm just telling you.
Yes, I get why gurus go that route. But yeah, I just felt wrong. I didn't like the experience. I felt very isolated, and I hit a wall. And I actually thought back to my experience where the bento first appeared, and I said, I just need to hit pause for a month. So for 1 month, I canceled all the events. It was just like, hey, just going to go quiet for a little bit. Just need a little recharge. Like I did before, I just read books and did other things, but just tried to feed myself. And I read 2 things that just leapt out at me. One was I was reading a book I've read many times called Our Band Could Be Your Life. And it's the story of punk rock and hardcore in America. And it's about many of my favorite bands. And in all these stories, it's like the story of Black Flag, Sonic Youth, Minor Threat. And all these stories, some band somewhere in America would be making weird music because it's the early 80s. They need someone to put out their music. They have to physically make it and release it. They need a label. No one would put them out because who are you? And what they always did is they would make their own label. And making their own label was just a logo and an address. There's really not much more to it than that. But there was this funny thing where by the act of creating a label to publish themselves under, it created an invitation for other people to make work in a similar spirit. And so the act of putting out the first thing, putting out one punk record, manifested more punkness because other people would show up and say, I make music like that. Will you put me out? And suddenly what was first, well, we were just doing this to put out our thing, but sure, I guess. And all of these SST records, Discord records, Alternative Tentacles, they all started off, K records, they all started off in the same way. So there's this act where creating a label is manifesting some aesthetic in the world.
Yeah, it's a beacon. It's a beacon that draws to it what would otherwise be lost in the noise, and it can come together as a signal.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I read at that same time was about, I don't remember why, but I was interested in reading about the Royal Society. I'd been aware of the Royal Society, but it's like a group of scientists in the UK. And I was reading about their history. And the Royal Society started in 1660 when Sir Christopher Wren and some other academics who taught natural law, which was the term in the 17th century for things only God would know. Like, what is blood made out of? How do our bodies work? What's in the heavens? Like all these things. So they taught this. And every Thursday they would go to a pub. And the pub they met at is still there. And they would meet every Thursday and they would talk about their work. And at some point, someone had the idea of, what if we started a club? And our club is dedicated to the idea of proving facts through evidence and not through what the church or king declares.
Shazam, the Enlightenment.
Yes, everyone thought it was a great idea. So they start publishing the first zine. It's called Philosophical Transactions. They publish it every month. And what it featured was the members trying to do what we now call science. They were running experiments. And they're just detailing, here's how I tried to test this. And every month, a new issue came out. Eventually, the group started putting money in to help fund people's projects. And through Philosophical Transactions and the Royal Society, that's how the Babbage machine was funded. It's how the first microscope was made. The first microscope's images were printed. It's where Sir Isaac Newton first published. It's where Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment was published. It's where the peer review was invented, where the scientific method was invented. And that happened through this iterative process of just publishing a monthly journal, trying to prove facts through evidence. And they taught the world to see things that way. And so reading these things back to back, I thought these are the same thing, actually. They're doing the same thing. It's a group of people who hold some common worldview, and they agree to release work by themselves and others that reflects what holds them together. And I saw examples all over as soon as I thought that way, like the Whole Earth Catalog is a label in the same way. The Project Mischief is a label in the same way. Every publisher, every magazine, every art gallery, they're all kind of in a similar zone. Just for myself, I wrote up these thoughts and said, I believe there's this thing called a culture label, and it's existed for, I believe the first one is 1660, and this has actually been maybe the most durable form of cultural influence that's ever existed. And so I wrote a Google Doc for myself, wasn't sure what to do with it, but just sent it to a few friends who are artists just to be like, is this the most obvious thing you've ever read? Can you just tell me what you think? And over, just heard back, wow, never thought of this before. It felt insightful. And they were saying, how would I do this? What do you do to do this? And it just kept calling. It just kept calling.
A couple of different things in there. One is, just in the last interview, we were talking about Brian Eno's concept of scenius. And what you're saying is that sceniuses follow a pattern of creation. By the way, are you familiar with that term, scenius?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, just to make sure.
I was with Brian 2 days ago.
Yeah, tried to get him on the show. I want him to talk about scenius. So this idea, it makes a lot of sense to me. It makes total sense right away.
Yeah, so there's this form. So, okay, here's this form. And at the same time, I was just thinking about this. Someone I slightly knew named Rob Kalin, who is the founder of Etsy, he reached out and said he was working on something new and would I talk to him about it. I did, and it was an interesting idea. And he asked me to be a co-founder. So we started working on this thing together. And honestly, I did it because I needed a job. And I like Rob. He's a real artist, but I needed a job. And we spent several months working on that together and then kind of hit a wall with it. Wasn't what we thought. And then I brought up this label thing I've been thinking about, which I hadn't shared to that point. And I recently had the idea to call them meta labels. Like, I think that's the structure. It's not a culture label, it's a meta label. And so shared this idea with Rob and with a couple other people that we were collaborating with. And there was just a instant heat of, yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. And so that was November 2021. And then since then, we have begun to make and put out work together. And this is where there's a lot of interesting, I'll get to our design choices in a minute, but we've been putting out as a label, we ourselves have been a label, because to do the thing, be the thing. So we needed to first be a label. Our first release was the manifesto, which was my original essay made a little better. Second release was a tool that let people imagine themselves as a label, and it was very bento-like. And kept iteratively putting out work, including tools for people to release work, and just experimenting for the last couple of years. And it's all culminating in, it'll probably be out by the time this goes live, I would guess, but in the next week or two, Metalabel will go live as a new space for releasing, selling, and exhibiting creative work. You could think of it as like Bandcamp for everything, or Etsy for creative work. And underlying this whole structure where you can release or sell physical or digital work, tickets to things across any creative medium, because the thing about labels today is they don't stay in one medium. You operate everywhere. That's what everyone has to do. So Spotify, these siloed things don't make sense, I don't think. So it's like an open design space. And underlying this whole system is this reinvention of a label, which is a creative group of people who choose to co-release work together. So on Metalabel, a creator on their own or with as many friends as they want, they can create an identity through which they will publish work. They can publish work by themselves, by a collection of them. They could sign someone and release their work through their label. They can create financial contracts between the releases to say how much money should everyone get from a drop. And it's a whole stack to let people create collective release vehicles. Because what I saw with myself when I was burnt out on Bento, I was this creator economy, rise and grind, like go get my followers every day kind of thing. I was in the single player mode is where I got trapped. And this is imagining a Metalabel. This is a multiplayer mode of, well, it's not just me. I have peers. And sometimes I drop something. Other times I'm just like editing someone else's thing. But you know what? It's all us. And so I believe that is the next era of creative work online. I believe that is the next era after this past decade of the internet really hyper individualized us, even as it connected us in nodes in a network. It treats us as all isolated nodes. Every system is architected around individual users. Our system is architected around users and groups that can be portable, have a lot of different functions. And yeah, I think this is the next era of creative work. And labels have fallen out of fashion because everyone hates record labels because of RIAA and all this sort of shit. But it is a form that deeply supports the needs of creative people, that allows people to amass cred, a treasury, meaning. So this is going to start, as I'm saying this, it's going to start next week with a new book published by me and a bunch of other people.
What's it called?
It's called The Dark Forest Anthology of the Internet. So I wrote a piece 5 years ago called The Dark Forest Theory of the Internet, which is applying Fermi's paradox to the idea of why I feel afraid to be myself online. It talks about how what I'd noticed from my own behaviors, what I thought a lot of us were doing, which was we were only being real in these dark forest spaces of small chats or podcasts that are non-gamified, non-pressurized, and we know there are not predators around, but we know that in every ClearNet channel, there are predators. It is dangerous. And this is how the internet is changing. And so I wrote that piece. And then since then, a bunch of great people like Venkatesh Rao or New Models or Peter from the Stoa or Josh Citarella have written pieces that improved on the idea, took it farther, took it deeper. So I've collected 11 pieces, both new and old, that I think are a canon that reflects this sort of real-time solidifying of this experience pre-COVID, during COVID, and now after.
I've heard that referred to as the cozy web.
Yes, that's Venkatesh's term. That's the second piece in the book.
I see.
Yeah,
okay.
That's also in the book.
Yeah, the cozy web. I'm a member of several cozy webs. I think you've spoken with Alex Komorowski. He curates several cozy webs. Cozy somethings.
Yes. Yeah, so that book will be the first thing published through Metalabel, and we have a bunch of great releases coming. And my hope is that this shows a model to people feeling burnt out for how they can feel more supported, how they can enjoy their work more. And we shall see.
That's fascinating. I want to talk about that all day. But I'm not going to.
Well, if I had to think about, you asked lessons I learned.
And I'm going to say lessons you learned and how they're manifesting in how you're doing this project.
When Rob and I started working together, we both have had great and hard experiences. We both have started successful companies. We have both had hard endings to our roles in our successful companies. We've both seen the good and bad of the game. Initially, this project was Rob and I together, 50-50 split, standard stuff. And then as the project shifted to Metalabel, and some people who were kind of at our crew we were working with, it just felt like we all need to be partners. This is about peerness. Even how we've started this off with this equity structure feels wrong. So it ended up redesigning and really thinking hard about what the system should be. And so I personally like simple, uniform systems that remove decision-making. So as an example of this, I thought, if you imagine 100% of a startup's equity allocation, how much of a company's value is starting the company? How much should someone get for starting? What is the value of that? Now, typically, the value is like everything you can get. But I saw the dangers of that with Kickstarter, and I saw the outcomes that didn't play out the ways that felt right. And Rob saw with Etsy. And so instead, we said, you know what the value of starting a thing is? It's 5%. What is the value of having the idea? Let's say having the idea is a different value than starting. We'll say that having the idea of 5%. Now, let's imagine how might this equity work moving forward, and came up with the idea that to maintain this level of partnership, we should think about equity being essentially the same for anyone that joins in a given year. And that each year is like a different chapter of the company. So anyone who joins in chapter 2, you get this percent. And it's just flat. It's just flat. Made the decision that we would all get paid the same salary. We all got paid the same salary, same equity. Very just simple. Try to make it simple. And think about the equity of this company as something that we want to be allocated to the people who create the value of this project over time. And we don't know who that's going to be. But it's not going to be that the founders hold that value forever and you pry it from their cold, dead hands. Don't think that really works out. So ended up with a situation of there were 7 of us as co-founders. 7 of us. And then I also, at Kickstarter, I came to, it shows up in my book, really hate being at the top of this hierarchy. It was isolating. It was just like, it's not the best way to do things because in some things I'm the right person to make the decision, but in other things I'm not, actually. It shouldn't roll up to me. But also I believe that hierarchies are important. And I believe that leadership is important and a final decision-making power is incredibly important to define. So instead, we first thought about the model of a film set. So if you imagine a film set, it's the cinematographer making decisions about how they're shooting the shot. It's the editor that makes the first cut. It's the actor or actress who decides their performance. And then it's the director who ensures that everyone who is an expert at their own craft, that their work leads up to the same vision. But actually, everyone is being entrusted to make their best judgment. And in fact, it's the only way it works, is if everyone does that and does it well. And eventually, we evolved the language to say that we are a heterarchy. A heterarchy is a fluid hierarchy, where depending on the decision, there's a different person empowered to make that call. How that works in practicality is that all of us we have partners and associates. So all of us as partners, we have the freedom to make a final call in our area of expertise. I don't want our engineer to wait for all of us to come to consensus on something about the architecture. I want them to use their expert judgment and seek opinions if you need it. But the way we can move fast and the way that we can be a group of senior peers is if we all have that authority. And I, as a director, have that vision thing, which feels kind of CEO-y, especially if you use the Fred Wilson definition of the job of a CEO. Hold the vision, get the right people, make sure you have money in the bank. But for each individual release that we put out, there's a different member of the squad who had that idea, and they're the director of that release. So it's an organizational structure that I think of as being very leaderful. And there's other things like we have a constraint of being small intentionally, but trying to create certain constraints that I think preserve a fun experience, creative latitude, risk-taking, and just trying to anticipate the ways that every company is constantly drifting towards mediocrity. Being mediocre is the easiest thing every day. Every day, your life is just trying to make you average and uninteresting, and you have to fight it with everything you have. If I think of that as me as an entrepreneur, my battle against organizational entropy is an unfair fight. It is infinitely more powerful than I am, infinitely more powerful. So how do I create constraints to fight it? And so all this is built into how we're working.
Fascinating. One of the things I had never really thought about before is why we assume that equity and decision-making should go together. Why does ownership and money go with decision rights? That's an artifact. That doesn't have to be the case. Now, it so happens that there's a way in which you distributed equity and you distributed decision-making rights at the same time. But a part of the assumption, I think, is that money and wisdom go together, but also that it's the ownership stake that's going to incent you in the right direction. And so there's this idea that the ownership stake does that. And often that's a money ownership stake as opposed to a vision ownership stake. Anyway, there's just these things that tend to move together that don't have to. And you're tinkering with that. You're more than tinkering. You're renovating.
We're trying to design something really from the ground up. And as I've kept telling the team, if we fail, no problem. We're so small. We have low spend. It's we can manage it. We're very flexible. This model becomes challenged in conditions of success, actually. That's where it becomes hard. That's where I don't know what are the limits of this way of operating or working, but it has felt quite invigorating and refreshing. And if I look at everything that I found demoralizing and demotivating about my past experiences, this is trying to design against them. So it's, there's some self-talk. I have a theory that everyone is tweeting to themselves. This is some self-talk happening here, but what's better than wisdom and experience? And to be able to know, you know what, this is where it's going to end up unless we don't fight it early on. That's a gift to be given that. And overall, this whole thing feels like a gift because it is a gift. Because I'm getting the chance to, and I didn't want to be a founder again. My title's a director, not CEO. I didn't want to be a director boss again. But being in the seat, being called to service again, I get to see on a daily basis how I've grown, how the Yancey of today is better understands themselves than the Yancey of 10 years ago. And to have those moments, almost like a deja vu of, oh, in the past, I would have done this, and instead I saw it for what it was and did that, is a gift. It's a gift.
Yeah, I mean, it's starting off on the right foot. It's so hard to pick a company up out of one structure once it's a certain size. And the risks are a lot higher, which is that as you grow as a company, the people who work there essentially become hostages to the company's fortune that you're responsible for.
Early on in Kickstarter, I read a academic paper by Jeffrey West, who's a physicist. I believe he's at the University of New Mexico when he wrote this paper. And the paper is about the golden rule in biology, which says if you give an animal's weight, you can determine basically everything about its life. Its gestation period, how long it will live, how much it eats, everything. There's a golden ratio that's universally true across living things. And he applies the same model to social structures. And some of the paper is looking at it for cities. And he shows that if you tell him how many gas stations a city has, he can tell you how many people live there. If you say how many hospitals or whatever, that there's a similar relationship. And then he also finds that cities never die, which is an interesting point. But instead, he finds that companies, he also studies organizations, and organizations are organic life forms, he finds, because they are born, they mature, and then they die. And the point of maturity is, another way of looking at it, the point where death begins. And what he finds is, what is that point where a company begins that process of diminishment? And his line was 50 people. And he said, once you get to 50 people in his studies, I don't know his source, but once you get to 50 people, the company begins to hire operations people, admins, more accountants, people who exist to support the infrastructure of the organization itself rather than the core purpose of the organization. And the second you begin to hire people who exist for the good of the org rather than the mission of the org, the company then must grow faster than it adds those people to not die. And that this race is where you get financial maximization. This is where you get all the things we're talking about. And yeah, he draws this line at 50 people. We at Kickstarter were like 18 people when I read this. And my co-founder, Perry, and I, we sat in a room and where we wrote on the board, okay, here's the last 32 hires or whatever of Kickstarter, 20 hires, and mapping out what those rules would be, wanting to stand at that 50 number. And then in the midst of that plan, we became headline news and suddenly we had more support tickets than we knew to do with. And then you're just like, well, we got to grow. But yet everything I read in that paper, I saw. That's where I think of those forces, that organizational entropy that is so powerful and beyond us. That paper to me spoke to a bit about and tried to like specifically identify where that happens, why that happens.
Yeah. We had Gary Hamel on the show who wrote Humanocracy, which you may have run across, but it's all about keeping companies small. And even a steel company, he describes steel companies that are very successful, 250 people, you would think steel companies. It's got to be all about scale. And his thing was, no, you keep them small, you keep them regional, you keep them close to the customer. You give lots of decision-making to the people in the organization, and you have no organizing functions. None of the operations functions that you're talking about. So no HR department. I've spent a lot of my career being the person who tries to get these gigantic companies to work. So head of business architecture, it's like, come on, we've got to change direction, and we're 100,000 people. How do we do that in a coordinated way? And I'm not sure it ever worked, honestly.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
It's definitely tilting at windmills, I'll say that. It's like, I think we can do this, but I have to suspend disbelief really hard to make that happen. One of the quotes in the book that I really enjoyed was from the Bible, and it was, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world." And the word rulers, I looked up a couple of different translations. It doesn't always come out as rulers. Sometimes it comes out as forces of darkness. It doesn't mean people. It means the system is absolutely what it means. And the word that was used in the Bible was this sort of sense of demonic forces or bad forces. And then if you continue, what the next line is, "Stand, therefore, having your loins girt about with truth." That's great language. That is great language.
It is.
But that's what you have to do going into a company like this as you start it up, which is that you're recognizing that there are forces that are beyond your control, that if you let them go, they will turn the company into a shape which is maybe financially maximizing, which is then a part of the problem you're trying to solve, or maybe it's just not the shape you want. And so you must have your loins girt about with truth to recognize when it's going astray.
Yes. If I compare the version of me now versus the 28, 29-year-old person starting Kickstarter, the person today is infinitely humbler. Not that I was some cocky whatever, but you're like, this won't be hard, or we got this, or they're all so stupid, or, all of these young person. I look at my younger self. Oh, you, very nice, good try. But yeah, there is less humility. And now as I step into it, I'm infinitely wiser, infinitely more skilled than I was then. And I look at everything and I say, wow, everything is so hard. And I don't look at any single task and think it's easy. Literally, there's nothing I look at and say that's easy, because I think absolutely everything must be done with the utmost care. And I don't care what you're doing. That is hard. I mean, it's joyful. It's wonderful. Hard's not the right word, but it's real effort. And yeah, I just don't look at anything as easy anymore. And that's really what I took away from that.
I have a couple of closing questions I ask at the end of every show. What do you hire your job to do for you?
Well, I think my answer to that question is different than it has been. I think that younger version, it was to help create my identity and my value and my worth, show me where I am in the world. And I think for young men especially, that's a rite of passage that you carry embedded in you. I have been freed of that now. And now I am, this is going to sound cheesy, but I'm called by a spirit. For however reasons I have layered in me a set of experiences and perspectives and skills that come from being the son of a waterbed salesman and a secretary at a college, that lend themselves well to serving complicated goals with other groups of people. And I've done it enough to know I'm in the upper percentile of skill at many of these things. And I am just called. Those things call to me. I'm this sort of person that when someone is speaking to a crowd and says, some of you are called by public service and you want to do whatever, come be a teacher, come whatever, serve your country. There is something inside of me that's like, so activated by that I don't even know what to do with myself. And I don't want it. I'm like, shut up. I don't want that. I just want to go read a book. Just shut up already. But there is just something there. And now I'm just excited by just manifesting things. It's just so fun. So fun. And I have many projects that drive me and other books in the works and all kinds of things that are all just for me because they're fun. They're not for ego, not for rep, not for legacy. It's just because they're there. And I've learned to listen. And I think the next 15, 20 years, I hope to be a creative peak of knowing myself, having learned some things, and still having such a great drive and thirst and curiosity to just explore, try, do, make, and taking care of myself is keeping myself in that pocket, ready to perform and listen.
What does your job cost you?
Well, I know in the past it cost me my friendships, never my family because I have my head on straight, but certainly many friendships. Now I don't think it costs me anything because I don't have a job. I just am. And it gets overwhelming. I'm a little terrified of our platform going live. It's been great to be in the lab. I lived on the West Coast where I could just disappear. Now I'm back in New York in the mix. And right now it's 3:00. I have yet to not be in a meeting since I woke up today, and I won't be for several more hours. This is not what I wanted, yet I'm here. And maybe I'll find a limit. Maybe I will find there's a cost, but not yet.
Where can people learn more about you and your writing, but also Metalabel?
Yeah, Strickler, first initial last name.com is my personal website where you could see everything I've written. My public writing going back to 2000 when I was a music critic for Pitchfork. So you go there, metalabel.com, metalabel.com. I'm out there. Come find me.
Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Dart. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.